Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you can do is to like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest today, Professor Susan Woodward. Professor Woodward teaches at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She is an expert on Balkan, East European, and post-Soviet affairs, on intervention in civil wars, and on post-conflict reconstruction. She is the author of two books, Balkan Tragedy, Chaos and Dissolution After the Cold War, and Socialist Unemployment, The Political Economy of Yugoslavia. Professor Woodward, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thank you. I would like to add that my most recent book is called The Ideology of Failed States, Why Intervention Fails. So that also starts off with my Yugoslav experience and many others.
Excellent. We'll add that in the description box, and thanks for adding. Professor Woodward, I wanted to talk to you given three reasons primarily. Of course, the Balkans are known to the outside world now as a region not having any creativity in terms of offering political ideas. This is primarily because of what happened in the 90s and afterward. Within the Balkans, within the successor states, with all humility, if I could say that there is also a lot of amnesia. There is a lot, mostly driven by nativist nationalism and what happened afterward, about what happened after the Second World War. And this is something I don't think is just a characteristic of the region. I mean, even in India, we have a very twisted understanding of what had happened in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s because of a rise of orthodoxy that presents these 40 years in a caricatured form. So that's my second motivation. And the third motivation, if I may say, is we live in a world which is more connected than ever, even though Trump administration is running roughshod over it in a very negative way.
Right.
But it's hard to imagine a world that is not connected with the larger world. And it's also hard to imagine a world, even as we reimagine post-capitalism, socialism, call it whatever you like, which doesn't have a private sector and which doesn't have a public sector. And I think your work in particular, Yugoslavia, offers us a way to understand that these aspects. So I want to understand these things from you, but if we could start with why did you study the region? Because it was not China in the 60s and 70s where a lot of people were taking interest because it was grand, it was large, it was an agrarian revolution, it was exciting. It wasn't also Soviet Union, which was one of the superpowers. What made you study the Balkans?
Well, mine is a very personal story of being wanting to use to apply to an undergraduate program at my university that was it was created in 1948, which tells you something about the United States at the time, called Student Project for Amity Among Nations. But it was that it would identify, the students ran it, and it would identify 4 countries, one in each part of the world, each year, and they would change each year, where students would apply the year before, study that country for a year before, and then they would go for the summer to do a research project about which they would then write a thesis during their last year at university. And I decided I wanted to do this program, and I would do whatever European country they chose on the belief that I should go slow steps towards travel. I think that was the wrong choice, but anyway, Yugoslavia was the country. And so I was already interested in it. But let me jump forward to the assumption you're making about what was interesting in the 60s and the 70s for academic community, because the people who were studying the Yugoslav self-management system, this workers' democracy in all workplaces, not just profit-making economic ones, were very active. There's even a whole center at Cornell University about labor-managed firms. There was a journal, lots of economists who were interested in this system. So even though that's not why I chose to go to Yugoslavia, it was certainly one that people talked about quite a lot.
And was it, I'm just trying to think based on your response, was it because in some ways, the disappointment with the Soviet Union, whether real or perceived, and on the other hand, I think is this relatively more popular idea about worker self-management in the West. I mean, this is my experience talking to many people from the West. If when I talk to socialists and leftists in the East, they often the larger questions are about centralized planning, relationships between markets and planning, relationship between agriculture and industry. But when I talk to people from the West, I mean, I'm not saying they don't focus on those aspects, but a large share of their focus is worker self-management. So I wonder if that's also part of that equation.
Well, I don't know the answer to that. What I can say is that much of the interest in general about the Yugoslav system came from people who got very interested in the younger Marx in sort of during the 60s and the 70s. And so philosophically, this idea of the decline, I'm thinking the wiping, let me think anyway, the end of the state. And so that was of great interest to people in some ways. Secondly, at least in the United States, there were some worker-managed firms, especially in the Northwest, and there was interest in the Moncloa examples in Spain, and actually quite a lot of lawyers' firms worked as cooperatives. So there was a general interest in what this meant. Now, mind you, I think probably to a certain extent, the fact that the Yugoslav case for international relations scholars represented an independence from the Soviet Union. After all, that's what it was about. And secondly, that it was a founding member of the non-alignment movement, 1955 and on, was always extremely interesting to a certain group of people. I think I could go on. There were lots of reasons to be interested in Yugoslavia.
Absolutely, of course. So if we could start with the worker self-management itself, what was it in Yugoslavia? Because in your book on unemployment, you say that there is this caricatured view of worker self-management, which says that the workers are driven only by self-interest and they corner as much resources as possible to themselves, eventually leading up to the drying on investment side. They don't understand about the international situation. They don't understand about the long term, that if resources are not poured into productive investments, in the long run, they would lose out. But they just corner as much as resources for their consumption, eventually demand outstripping production, and that leads to stagflation and so on. And your whole book pushes against that. So if you could give us uh, a picture of the larger political economy by focusing on what the worker self-management was.
That's quite a large question. Let me see if I could at least begin. We have to go to the history of this Yugoslav change. And in 1948, there was a debate between Stalin and Tito. Tito, at this point, the leader of what was called the League of Communists of Yugoslavia. They intentionally changed the name from Communist Party to reflect, we could go on, but there were lots of debates. And we still, in the literature on Yugoslavia, have debates about what the conflict was about. But for the most part, I'm persuaded by the ones there were two. One, that Stalin was very upset that Tito had a foreign policy, particularly towards Albania, Greece, and Bulgaria, creating a Balkan Federation, supporting the Greek communists in the civil war that was taking place in the 40s, as well as in the war. that Stalin thought was independent-minded and not following what he would want. So that was partly it. But I also argue, and you will have seen this if you read that book, is that the Yugoslavs had what I call a Leninist strategy, not a Stalinist strategy, that included following what we talk about as the new economic policies in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, which meant a particular development strategy. And the development strategy would not collectivize agriculture. It would leave it mainly private, except for some latifundia-like large estates in the northern part of Yugoslavia, which was suitable for large estates in the Vojvodina, and also wanting to keep open trade, and follow a sort of an open economically oriented strategy for development. And that wasn't what Stalin apparently, who knows, we didn't ever ask him about it. He died after all in 1953 anyway. But I think that was also, in my view, a criticism. But the point being of why am I giving you this history is when this break takes place, by which I mean Yugoslavia, which had already itself been the origin of the notion of the common form and the first meetings, when all of the Eastern European countries, which by then had been become members of what we call the Soviet bloc, all stopped trading with Yugoslavia, boycotted. They were economically completely eliminated. So the United States, so I'm talking about this conflict is in June, July. By the next January, 1949, the Americans had seen an opportunity to break among the Soviet and pro-Soviet countries. And so they started to help. There was a sort of keeping Tito afloat was the title of the initial argument. But by the end of 1949, first of all, they had to go into a brief one, of their development strategy to build an independent defense. That meant sending farmers, peasants into the factories, which is part of what we could talk about at some point in the brief change in their agricultural policy, not collectivization, but what looked like to some people. And to start getting support from the United States. First, it asked some of its European colleagues to start trading with Yugoslavia. The US wouldn't itself, but Britain, the Netherlands, Belgium, and then to get the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to start lending to Yugoslavia. And so that is the beginning of what I argue in that book, of a change in not only development strategy, but management, when they need to get workers, skilled workers, or they decide to get skilled workers is a better way to put it, to make decisions about investment and wages. Now, that sounds like what we call workers' democracy, workers' self-management, that they would be. And secondly, as you said, the critics of the system argue that they would just put it in their pockets, but that's not at all what happened. It was mainly to use workers to be willing to fire their fellow workers who were not skilled. So it was all related to the trade-oriented policy. Now, we could go on further, but I think it's important to know that self-management was an economic decision that was in many ways very appropriate to who should be making decisions about investment, the people who are actually in the Workers' Council, which would be elected every year, and to make these kinds of decisions.
Yeah, there are so many aspects for me to ask you. But if I could ask you little bit about the employment divisions. I mean, your book gives us a chart of about 42% industrial workers, roughly 20%, let's say, about transportation and construction, and 17 to 18%. I'm quoting from memory, don't hold me on that, but
I can't even
services.
remember
Yes,
myself.
yes, 17% around on services. But if you could tell us a little bit about this public-private breakup and who were privileged to what extent, who could influence decision makings, and who were at the lower level, who bear the brunt of those adjustments to international trade. I assume that those in the there was a sentence in your book which said that those in the agriculture used to wait until their moment would come to go into the public sector where there would be more privileges and benefits and so on. Can you give us a breakup of this public-private division within Yugoslavia?
I think there are two elements to it. The first is the public-private, which is basically urban and rural, and that most of the agricultural sector remains small landholders, very small farms, and private. And I'll come back to that. And the other is the public sector workers in industry, professional activities, education, theater, and so forth, that were skilled and under the system of worker self-management. But within that public sector, this is as my own argument about why they introduced this system of worker self-management was to be able to have the workers themselves make decisions about who would be fired if it was necessary in terms for accumulation in relation to trade. And that would be true. Now, it was the belief, or at least so the public record says, I don't even know what their private thoughts were. It was a belief that because the private sector was in the agricultural sector in rural areas, that people could always, if they were going to be unemployed by these decisions in their firm, that they could go back to the farm, so to speak. Over time, there was no way. Most of them didn't have any leaks with the family farm or whatever. And so they did become unemployed. And then there were bureaus of unemployment that would mainly focus on giving training and, to a certain extent, monies to travel if they were going to move, go try and find a place of employment elsewhere. Although that's another long story. It wouldn't have much. There was a way of keeping labor settled as part of this system. Now, tell me more again of what you wanted to know about the public-private distinction.
I think one more question here would be of my interest would be how much of the industrial sector was geared to the outside export? I'm asking this because Yugoslavia was in the 50s and the 60s considered among those league of economic miracles, particularly in East Asia. And they relied a lot on this so-called export-led model, restraining on wages, but producing for the international market. And I think there was an element of that, a strong element of that in Yugoslavia. But I just want to double check what was the extent of that, how much of the industries were geared towards, let's say, domestic consumptions. I mean, of course, it's hard to demarket everything because technology would have to be imported, a lot of intermediate goods would have to be imported, and so there is no clear demarcation between the domestic and the international. But if you could tell us a little bit more about how much of the economy was dependent on exporting industrial goods.
Well, I don't have any numbers at my fingertips. And of course, this changed over time, but it was always export oriented. And it was the most of the industry, I think by the 1980s, when things were getting very difficult with the debt repayment, something like 80% of all firms were dependent on the import of intermediate goods, intermediate materials. But it did change over time, and part of it was because it was the programs of debt repayment or borrowing of debt repayment to the World Bank, partly the International Monetary Fund, but especially to the World Bank, was precisely this, was to favor export orientation. So it's quite what you know in the criticism of most of the world by the time, by that time. But on numbers, I'm not saying, I'm not sure.
If we could take it a step back and ask you to tell us a little bit more about its this relationship that Yugoslavia had with the West. I mean, I think part of it goes back to the moment of 1942, 43, correct me if I'm wrong, but once the Chetniks basically gave up their resistance and became collaborators with the Nazis. The partisans led by the Communist Party became the only alternative to resistance against the Nazis. And I think it was this moment where the Western Allied forces thought that that's the only alternative against the Axis, and they supported it. But nevertheless, it seems to me that things remained open in terms of what the future lies in. And you told us about this moment of 1948, the split between the Soviet and Yugoslavia. I mean, the political side of the story is, of course, the expansion into Greece by using Bulgaria and Albania. And the story that we read was that Stalin didn't want to do that because apparently he didn't want to confront the West because that would be considered more expensive. But you said that there was a more ideological story to it, including collectivization, agriculture, and so on. Tell us about more about why was Yugoslavia not integrated with the Soviet bloc, while the Eastern Bloc got integrated with the Soviet bloc, and it had a much more open relationship with the West, but also the Third World.
Well, let me first say that it wasn't until quite late in World War II that, as a result of the British, and particularly Churchill, having sent a military person, Fitzroy MacLean, to work with the partisan forces, that they decided that they were really doing the fighting and that the Serbian royal forces were not. So it wasn't as soon as you mentioned. And so it was quite late that they were getting support, but they did eventually get some support. But the support was done with strings attached. They had to agree to work with the royal government. That's not so important to our story, but I just want to say it's the complicated how much was said, and indeed. The Americans, who were mainly in charge of the money supporting UNRWA, the UN Reconstruction and Repair funds right after World War II, they were not allowing Yugoslavia to get anything. So there wasn't much support from the West at all. And Yugoslavia had been, I mean, the Tito and his forces before World War II had been very much members of the communist, the alliance. And as I say, the idea of the common form was theirs. So it's not clear to me at the moment, I haven't thought about this for some time, about how one would characterize the relationship with the Soviet Union between the end of the war and 1948, when there was this quarrel. But it is true that Tito was very much involved in wanting to influence the neighborhood, Albania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia. So you could, looking backwards, one could see that there was probably going to be a conflict with Stalin. Now come back to the other second half of the question you were asking me to remind me.
Oh, I was just wondering, while the Eastern Bloc went with the Soviet Union, Poland,
Yeah.
Hungary, and so on, but Yugoslavia didn't. And as a student of history, it is a bit of puzzle because conditions were very similar in many of these regions, but they went along different directions. So that was my question.
I mean, it's interesting you say that, because most of Central and Eastern Europe, even right after World War II. Bulgaria went, there isn't a bloc until 48, 49. But joining with, having communists take over the government in Czechoslovakia was by elections. In Bulgaria, it was a decision as a result of the alliance during the war. There are different ways. Most of those countries, except maybe Bulgaria as well, were industrialized countries. Czechoslovakia had been a parliamentary democracy. So I'm not so sure that the conditions, Yugoslavia being I think again, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but in 1945, at the end of the war, 85 to 90% of the population was still in agriculture. So it was not at all industrialized, except for in Slovenia and the Northwest that had been a part of the Austrian crown lands and done lots of reforms already in the 18th century, which have influence later. And certainly part of Croatia, because the Yugoslav Communist Party was based on trade unions in Slovenia and Croatia, and it was only during the war where the plenums that the party was having these conferences had to decide what to do with joining, including Macedonia, including Bosnia and Herzegovina, even to a certain extent, including Serbia, because they were not. We can get back to the debates in Marx and then Lenin about what do you do if it's not already industrialized. But it's not clear to me that conditions throughout what become the Soviet bloc are determining of the outcome in terms of their alliance with the Soviet Union. It was more a geostrategic situation where they were being, it's a long story. I think we should stop it at that point.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Although I was thinking, like, even the Soviet Union, even though they came out of a Bolshevik ideology, which did rely on the Soviets, which were the industrial association of industrial workers primarily, but the Soviet Union itself began as an agrarian society, and
Yeah.
the social revolutionaries and the agrarian revolutions were very, very fundamental back in the days. Of course, by the late 1940s, the Soviet Union did industrialize a lot, and I'm not sure the most innovative ideas for agriculture at that time was taken over by others, China primarily,
Yeah.
but many other places. Um, okay, so I think I want to ask you next about the 70s in particular, because the stagflation that touched the whole globe, not just the socialist bloc,
Yeah.
the advanced capitalist economies. Um, Yugoslavia became very vulnerable to that. Part of the reason was because they relied on the export sector, and when there was shrinkage within the economy in the West, there was a fall of demand. Tell us more about what kind of structural adjustments it did to Yugoslavia in the 70s and the 80s that affected it.
Well, I'm not sure I can answer that question. I mean, the way in which the stagflation of the 1970s affected Yugoslavia mostly is foreign workers that are that it had this high unemployment, which I wrote the book about. So how can you have a socialist country committed to full employment, as all socialists are, or at least Marx historian, and have such a high unemployment rate? But a very large proportion of them, especially from the parts of the country that were in the west of Croatia and also Bosnia, were guest workers in Europe. And they were all then sent, and these guest workers were done on government to government contracts, like Germany and the Yugoslavs would have contracts that would allow these workers to come to Germany mainly, but also to Belgium and to Switzerland. And they were all returned home. So that already affected unemployment very seriously in the Yugoslav case. Structural adjustment doesn't really start in the sense that we now talk about it until 1979, 1980. And it is actually the case that Yugoslavia was the first, even to the point of being called an experiment, the first experiment of these standby structural adjustment programs that the International Monetary Fund designed 3 years at a time to do austerity, to repay the debt. That's because it's not because of stagflation in the 70s. It's because of, I think, Ronald Reagan's decision to tell the IMF to be much more radical in terms of going after debt and to save a lot of American commercial banks. But it does begin in 79, 80 to what we call the global debt crisis. And Yugoslavia was the first case. Now, sadly, because part of what we were calling in our discussion exports was actually the tourist sector in Dalmatia. So it was people coming to Yugoslavia, but it was for the export earnings. And so what's happening by 79, there's an earthquake in Montenegro that affects the tourist sector. There are already the stagflation is affecting their export earnings, gets even worse in 1980. But Yugoslavia is finding it much more difficult not to repay the debt, but at least to process it. And so by 1980, the IMF just starts these 3-year austerity structural adjustment programs where they were cutting. And this was very harmful, as it's pretty obvious to anyone who's listening to our discussion, that if a good portion, 80% of your industry is dependent on the imports of intermediate goods, and those were the ones that were then subject to import restrictions. So it already had a very serious effect on the economy.
It was it was related to external debt. I'm not sure if internal debt had any meaning in Yugoslavia, did it?
No, I don't think so. What would we call internal debt? No.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm asking this because today we are in the context of these structural adjustment programs. One of the criticisms by many is that the IMF uses its disciplining tool to reduce the debt, not just for the external debt, but also internal debt, which is meaningless. So that's
Yeah,
the
I
case
didn't.
in Sri Lanka, for instance. The IMF says it's not just the external debt, but you also have to bring down the total debt to GDP ratio for us to give you these packages of loans, and that has a dire effect because you then have to shrink your public sector enormously.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that. That's very interesting. I mean, I will say one of the things that's important about the structural adjustment programs in Yugoslavia in the 1980s, or starting in 79, is political rather than economic, in the sense that one of the requirements, I mean, it may be too strong a word, but I will use it, of the World Bank loans starting already from 1949-52 on. Very important in terms of 1958, when Yugoslavia decided to join the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, the predecessor to the World Trade Organization, of proposing, encouraging ever more decentralization. And by the late 70s, Yugoslavia was probably the most decentralized political system in the world. And what happened was, all of a sudden, having urged decentralization at stages over and over and over again, especially from 1958 on, for joining the GATT, the IMF got very concerned that it was so decentralized that Yugoslavia didn't have any capacity for monetary policy, both fiscal and trade. And so it started demanding, as a part of these structural adjustment programs, that there be re-centralization of control over foreign trade and other kinds of investment decisions. Slovenia being the most export-oriented, having to go back all the way to its being part of the Austrian Crown lands and early industrialization. And its location too, it was on road and rail networks right aside Austria, Italy, and Switzerland. Slovenia, we could go on at length talking about the leadership in Slovenia starting in the 1920s of wanting to join Yugoslavia first instead of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then to use Yugoslavia as a way eventually to be an independent state. I was having a conversation with a Bosnian colleague about this just the other day, and we both agreed that that was it. But that said, by the 1980s, there were groups in Yugoslavia in Slovenia who were opposed to taxation in general. They thought that the monies for the federal army, which is almost the only thing that was being paid for by the federal government, was too much. They didn't want to, even though that was the basis of Yugoslav independence, its policies to support NATO's southern flank. We haven't talked about that yet, but Slovenes were opposed. These were younger generation protesting the expenditures on weapons and the federal army on the one hand, and also what they had by the end of the 70s was control of the export earnings for all Slovene firms. Didn't go to the federal government. It stayed in Slovenia. So now they were losing both aspects of what we would call taxation or redistribution. And so I argue in my book that that it's the Slovenes who broke up Yugoslavia. They're the ones who went first for claiming independence, but they were doing it, Slovenes in the Slovene Republic. It's a federal system, so that we call these what states or republics. Throughout the 80s, protesting fiscal policy, defense policy, wanting to leave. And I think that the role of the IMF in insisting on re-centralization in order to manage the debt repayments was one of the crucial actions in terms of the end of Yugoslavia. Yeah.
It wasn't. It didn't go well with the Slovenians, right? The re-centralization program. It's very interesting, given there was something similar in China as well. Throughout the 80s, there was massive decentralization, so much so that by 1992, the center's share of the revenue falls down to just 22%.
Yes.
It was post-Tiananmen incident, so there was a lot of legitimacy crisis for the center as well. And so that's when in 94, it decided to re-centralize by introducing a VAT, the value-added tax. And in a couple of years, its share went up to 57% from 22%.
And to add the Soviet case, because when Gorbachev decides to do reforms, part of them are economic reforms and along very similar to what the Yugoslavs had done. So it was very easy for me as an expert on the Yugoslav path to watch the way in which this was changing and very much to repeat. But part of it included the Republic law to decentralize. And that was the moment at which the military staged their attempted coup against Gorbachev's reforms, because they could see that this decentralization to the republics of the Soviet Union would lead in the direction of the Yugoslav case.
This is extremely interesting, and I'm not sure if Chinese were looking at these developments. They must have, but that would be very interesting to chase through the archival records.
Well, they were very much. I mean, it's
Yes.
interesting. I will share. One of my sisters is an anthropologist specializing on Hungary. And at one point, there was a Chinese delegation to Budapest when she was there doing research. And I don't remember how this connection happened, but they asked her, I guess it would be to use that they would be using English, and she would be translating for English and Hungarian for this delegation. And they were there to study the Hungarian case as they were doing on the Yugoslav case, very much studying what happened But in the Hungarian case, apparently the delegation from China said, we're saying we're here to study the Hungarian case, but what we really mean is the South Korean case, but we can't say it. But yes, the Chinese government has been studying all of these all along.
Yeah, that's true. There were several conferences, some boat conferences in the mid 90s in China that had delegates from Hungary and other parts of Eastern Bloc. If you could tell us a little bit about the role of the defense here, because one of the implications for socialist states, one of the contradictions, if you may like, is the need for a defense industry. Is in it has to defend itself against the imperialist bloc in particular, but we can diversify into any other nations as well, and so that diverges from the standard idea of how resources should be funneled into use value goods. Of course, defense industry do create accumulations, and also it employs employment, so resources are utilized, but nevertheless there is wastage in terms of the conventional understanding of socialist economy. And
Right.
that generates a lot of pressure in the Chinese case, because of the hostility it faced in the early years. Mao had to concentrate a lot on industries, and that was the scissors gap. The Soviet Union faced it, or else it wouldn't have survived during the interwar period. China faced it. And so there had to be very, very significant diversion of resources to heavy industries, which also
Yeah.
means that consumer goods consumption has to be suppressed. Could you tell us what was that dimension for Yugoslavia to maintain an independent defense wing for itself?
I mentioned in 1949, January to December, that the Americans started to come to the aid slowly, step by step, to save, as they say, save Tito. That is to say, protect the decision by the Yugoslav authorities to separate from the Soviet bloc. And the exchange in the end was that Yugoslavia would have its independent defense. I'll say a minute about, but that they would play the role of protecting the NATO's southern flank. There was a southern flank through Yugoslavia on the way to Italy, and a northern flank through Poland to Germany. And so that was the sort of the agreement of why they needed to have this defense, was the exchange to enable them to be independent. And not only independent, but participate in 3 blocs, East, West, and non-aligned, which also we haven't talked about how much as export oriented that was actually very beneficial in some ways, because Middle Eastern bloc, markets, for example, were very, very important to them at certain points. But I have a chapter in the book on unemployment in Yugoslavia called the Faustian bargain, which I meant that this exchange of how much they had to spend on defense and maintaining that military had its costs. Now, you could say, because most of the defense strategy for Yugoslavia was under the League of Communists had 2 components. One was called territorial defense forces, which were based in the localities and were based very much on the Cuban idea as well, about the same time, but very much that. And so those were run by the municipalities and the republics in this decentralized system. Very important in terms of what happens during the wars that come after the breakup of Yugoslavia and their role. And the other was the federal forces, who were highly sophisticated weaponry and so forth, whose goal was to defend the country, first to defend against NATO, against the Soviet Union, if it were to follow a Soviet route in some idea of aggression, but also to defend Yugoslavia against any invasion from elsewhere, in order to give space and time for the territorial defense forces to mobilize the entire country. right? And so but the thing that was important to me in terms of thinking about what the costs were or not in terms of socialist goals is that the defense industries, because of this idea that you would defend and then allow everyone to return to, if there was invasion, to go into the mountains, into Bosnia, and defend the country. So all the defense and almost all the defense industries were in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so you could talk about whether that was good for Bosnia and Herzegovina now that it's independent and has a very different, again, borrowing from the World Bank and borrowing from the IMF, needing an export-oriented market on light manufacturers, whether that's good for it now. But it was certainly the basis of employment in the otherwise one of the two most poorest republics of Yugoslavia.
Was the defense against NATO, or was it also against the Soviet and Eastern Bloc?
No, it was completely against any invasion, keeping in mind that this was an alliance that was formed during World War II against the Axis. So Bulgaria, Italy, Germany. So who would know whether it would be the Soviet Union or who would invade? But it was against any external actors. The role it had for NATO was to defend NATO against any potential Soviet aggression through the southern route that would be, in a sense, to protect Italy, but also therefore the rest of Western Europe, if there was ever an invasion from the Soviet Union. Not that we ever expected it, but that was the basis of the NATO's argument.
If you could tell us a little bit about nationalism, I mean, we are slightly moving away from our main discussion, which is, of course, we have focused on the political economy. But since we want to understand, I want to understand the disintegration a little bit before we end. But before you tell us, give us a political economy explanation of the disintegration. If you could respond to the standard charge that the Marxist states and this is something I hear in Yugoslavia, because it was probably more heterogeneous than in China to some extent, because in China nationalism and socialism has always gone hand in hand. There is no such contradiction, if you like, between its different entities, but here we find that Marxist parties basically suppressed nationalism, culture, religion. All of that is not true, as I understand it. I mean, a lot of people there were religious, and they have a lot of religion: Islam, Roman Catholicism, Protestantism, Eastern Orthodox, and so on. And they didn't take, as far as my understanding goes, the Marxist parties didn't wage a war as it happened in China, at least until the late 1970s, and the Soviet Union. But what was nationalism in this entity that emerged after the First World War as a vassal states, but significantly transformed after the Second World War under the communist leadership? What was nationalism here?
Oh my goodness. The Yugoslav party had, starting with the end of the war, a slogan, brotherhood and unity. So the idea was that the federal system was based on the right of national self-determination of each of the nations that formed to create Yugoslavia. Keeping in mind that they were the results of independence from two empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire on the one hand and the Ottoman Empire on the other, with, of course, Venice on the coast. So three empires in that sense. And
Also, even Russia had had an enormous influence, not the way the Habsburgs and the Ottomans had, but Russian Empire, the shadow of the Russian Empire was also there, isn't it?
not so much.
Not so much. Okay.
No. Some people talk about, Misha Glennon writes about this in his book, The Balkans. in the late 19th century when a lot of Muslims were kicked out of the Soviet Union and they go south, but they mainly go to Bulgaria, not to Yugoslavia. There's an argument that because the Serbs are Eastern Orthodox, and therefore they must be friends of the Russians. And there's nothing in the history of Russian-Serbian relationship to suggest anything positive at all. I mean, there is a little bit now, I think, because of the Eastern Orthodox argument. But coming back to Yugoslavia, so you get the Slovenes are Jansenist, which is it's the Catholicism that's based on having been part of the Reformation and Protestant, and then Counter-Reformation wins after all, so that it's very, very, very strict morally in terms of strict Catholic. So that's one branch of Catholicism. The Croatians are Roman Catholic. The Serbs are Serbian Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox. Macedonians are Eastern Orthodox, and some, especially the Albanian population, are either Roman Catholic or Muslim, and Bosnia-Herzegovina is all three. Right? So you do have religious differences that are very much identified with the imperial systems before and their concept of nation. But you don't need the religious component to say that the argument to form a federation after World War II, instead of the monarchical system before World War II, was to give the right to national self-determination of each of the peoples, nations of Yugoslavia. So the Slovenes, the Croats, the Serbs, the Macedonians, the Montenegrins at one point, not separate, then that happens quite recently, mainly thinking of themselves as Serbs until quite recently. But in Bosnia-Herzegovina was this special province, according to Tito in the wartime plenum of the party, that would be a mixture of all three religions, but aimed at being a buffer against Croatia and Serbia. So you have a balancing act in the, but the idea is, and then in the north, in Vojvodina, where there are all of the results of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Hungarians, Romanians, Vlachs, and so forth, and in Kosovo, in the south of Kosovo, both of them couldn't have a separate republic on the argument that their nation, each of them, had a state elsewhere. And so they weren't allowed a republic, which would be giving them a second state, Albania, then Kosovo, and so. So that was, they only had autonomy, right? But nationalism, I don't really want to talk about nationalism until the 1980s, when right-wing people, especially in Slovenia and Croatia, are trying to leave and become independent and use the right to national self-determination to persuade the West that they had a right to independence. I don't agree with that at all, but that's another matter. And the sort of language of expropriation and to fight on which was really a fight against taxation in each of these republics in the 1980s under the context of this structural adjustment austerity policies, was done in national language. And there's no question that there were right-wing movements. But I think my own view is it was only mainly the Croatians who had a component of the population tied very much with emigres in the United States and Australia who were nationalist throughout. And I have that experience because I was living there. And there was, in 1968 to 71, what was called Maspok, the mass movement, which was aiming at more independence for the Croatian Republic than they had at the time, based on the nationalist argument. So you had waves in Croatia that were always nationalist,
were the 1981, was it called the Croat Spring protest? Were they part of this?
What spring?
Um there were these massive protests in 1981, if I'm not wrong, that led to, or was it 71? I'm sorry. I think that that gave more autonomy to to Croatia and Slovenia, and the Serbs saw that as, of course, the 1974 constitution was there. The Serbs saw that as massive concessions. But I think in around the time Tito passed away, there were these protests to which
Well,
Tito himself conceded to.
in 1970, I referred to the Croatian nationalist Croatian Spring.
Yes, yes, Croatian Spring, yes.
Yeah, and that's in 67 to 71. And Tito was allowing it until the military, who were saying over and over again, this is really dangerous because there are all these German right-wing activists coming down and actually starting wars, small war, fighting. And so in December 1970, Tito finally said, I put a stop to this. But the decentralization of the 1974 Constitution was not a result of that at all. It was just these, I argue, and I think I'm right, these stages of responding to the World Bank and IMF proposals for ever less role of the state, this neoliberal minimal state argument, by decentralizing. Tito dies in 1980, and in 1981, you have protests in Kosovo by especially university students wanting their autonomous region to become a separate republic. That's another story.
But that was not secessionist. That was just having more autonomy from Serbia within the federation.
At that point, yeah, it becomes by the 90s,
Right.
it's for independence.
So if you could sum up the disintegration, would it be too simplistic to say that it was the World Bank and the IMFs who overthrew the Yugoslavian as an entity by progressively decentralizing to an extent, and then supported by the Slovenians and the Croatians because they were probably seeing a better future with the West, given their much more privileged position within the productive sector? How would you define it?
No, I mean, first of all, the role of the IMF and the World Bank in the disintegration of Yugoslavia, I would say probably, I mean, it's big, but there are at least two. One, the austerity policies of the structural adjustment programs in the 1980s to repay the debt began to hit the professional administrative middle class. Finally, their children in urban centers were all finally facing unemployment. So you begin to get an undercurrent of loyalty to.
Just to be, this is the non-industrial workers, right? They're facing the brunt of unemployment. Is it right?
No, it's the children, urban children, children of urban parents who are either industrial or more likely professional and administrative classes. And they're the ones who are mainly the members of the party. And they begin to say, wait a minute, I'm not sure this is what we want. So the loyalty is begin. So that's one piece that is a result of the austerity policies. A second piece is the change by the IMF on saying it's too decentralized. You can't have any capacity for monetary policy at all. You have to re-centralize. And that leads the Slovenes to say, wait a minute, we're losing control of all of our export earnings. We're losing control of our decisions on investment, everything. We don't like paying these taxes that are being wasted by Albanians in Kosovo with unproductive investment in the first place, because there was a redistributive mechanism for development called the Federal Fund. So Slovenes were already protesting against that, being very nationalist in that sense of criticizing Albanians' prejudice. And and then for the same reason, not wanting to pay taxes for the federal army. And then I would say that you have to add the Europeans, who were, especially the Swiss and the Austrians, eventually the Germans, but especially the Austrians, Swiss, who were actually agreeing with the Slovene argument that they should have independence and saying the rest of the country should stay alone, but we support Slovene independence. So there was a very much an external actor role here. Not the United States, in fact. The United States comes much later in this story, Germany by the end of December. So it's accepting an argument that the Milosevic was the fault, they can't be democratic, they want to be a part of Europe. It was a sort of whole narrative that was supported by the Europeans and agreeing to let them go.
So effectively, the austerity programs hit the privileged class, working class, very hard, who thought that it wasn't working, and perhaps a breakup would work for us. That was one. The other was okay.
No. I don't. The working class, in the sense of trade unions and industrial workers and firms, were always in favor of keeping Yugoslavia together. And they were even quite active in the second half of the 80s, along with some initial political parties being created by intellectuals, socialist intellectuals.
Because they had good life. They had a social life through the work system. Yes.
I love to say that there was no passport in the world that could get you more access to more countries without a visa than the Yugoslav passport. It was, they were living beyond their means.
Right.
All of this borrowing. The people I was talking about becoming disillusioned with the system were the professional administrative class, because it was their children all of a sudden who, for the first time, were unemployed. I think that's the least important of the list I've made.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that it's part of what we've been talking about in terms of the political economy that was important. There were the people there to defend the country were all themselves focused on their own standard of living within their republic, which was getting very bad.
And the most important would be the Slovenians and the Croatians reacting negatively to the recentralization.
And seeing an opportunity to leave, which both of them had been wanting. I said this goes back to the 1920s with Vice President Edvard Kardel wanting to get a place for Slovenes against Austrians and Germans, because they were a minority, get them to have Slovene independence. So they first joined the Yugoslav country after World War I, and then quite literally we're planning towards independence for the entire period of the Yugoslav thing. The same thing with the Croatian. The Croatians is more complicated in terms of not such a simple, but by 1985, Franjo Tudjman, who had been a general in the partisan army and in the Yugoslav army, retired and became very much a nationalist. He had people in the United States going all over the country. A colleague of mine at Yale was one of them, to say that the Croatians should have independence. So he was fighting for independence from 85 on. So it wasn't just this IMF argument, but the whole fiscal aspect was sort of giving them both the explanation, I would think.
Professor Woodward, my final question, and feel free to be as brief as you would like, because you gave us more time than we thought it would need. What legacy of Yugoslavia remains for the world in terms of rethinking or executing a post-capitalist world, and what legacy does it leave for the people in the Balkans?
Oh dear, I wish you'd asked me this before to prepare. I actually not sure that there is a legacy. I mean, the younger generation in the last 10 years or so, throughout all of the now independent countries of the former Yugoslavia, have been talking about how much they've lost. That having such a fascinating country of so many mixtures, being able to go from one republic to another for they'd all go to the Dalmatian coast for holidays, and they'd go to Sarajevo for the best R&B music and so forth. They hear about what was so special, and many of them say they would like to recreate it. It's not going to happen, but that's to them a legacy of this um, ability of so many different kinds of people, the mosaic, so to speak, to live together, that was very, very special. And of course, those who had lived in it wish they had the standard of living that they had before, which was really quite wonderful.
What about the legacy of the welfare state, job security, worker self-management, and so on? Has all of that completely disappeared, or is there something that has remained?
No, I'm afraid it's completely disappeared. Yeah. I mean, it's disappeared. I do think it's tell me again what you said about in the not the self-management, but the
The the welfare state, job security.
yeah, because I mean the welfare state was I mean they had free healthcare, free education, certainly all of that. But it depended upon whether you were in the private sector or the public sector. Private sector was you didn't have a high standard of living. Why would people go to work in Europe as foreign workers if they had such a good, it was the safety valve. I mean, for me, the legacy is a negative one of what can happen to socialist values if you depend on borrowing from the World Bank and the IMF.
We'll leave it there, Professor Woodward. This was such an enlightening conversation. We are also ignorant about the past as much as I, as an Indian, about European history, and you were fantastic in clarifying so much of that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.